It's Keisha here with Defending the Early Years podcast. We'll be focusing on amplifying the voices of early childhood educators, advocates, and all of those who love children.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Defending the Early Years podcast with Keisha Reed. Today, I am joined by the lovely Dr. Denisha Jones. Denisha Jones is the executive director of Defending the Early Years, and also today, what we're going to talk about is a wonderful framework. It is titled Framework for Fostering Healthy Racial Identity in the Early Years, and it is a labor of love of Denisha Jones. So I'm so excited. Welcome, Denisha.
Thank you, Keisha. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad you're back doing the podcast and I get to talk with you about all the work I've been doing.
I know you've been busy, so I'm excited. I want to hear more. I was able to take a peek at it, and I can say off the back, it felt very digestible. Like I was like, okay, wait a minute, hold up. This is going to make a difference, and it can be used in what immediately came to my mind is that it could be used in lots of different types of environments that work with young children. So if you could just, tell us a little bit about this project and we'll go from there. I'm excited to hear more about it.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a labor of love for sure. And when I realized it's been 5 years since I got the funding to do this. So, I had this vision that I've been doing Black Lives Matter at school. We've been writing about it, researching it, teaching it to young children, breaking it down. And I just felt like we need an anti-racist framework for early childhood. So that was my thinking. And one of our funders approached us, with some offering like around COVID funding. And we weren't impacted by COVID that much. So we didn't need the funding for that. But we said, I said, look, I want to develop this anti-racist early childhood curriculum. Let me do it. And of course, the person said yes. And then I realized, wow, developing a curriculum is a lot of work, first of all. And then I started unpacking it, and I hired my friend Alba worked with me as an assistant to the project. And we realized there's just so much, right? So we ended up looking at 4 pillars of what an anti-racist framework would look like. And we got out of the curriculum language. It's a framework, right? Curriculum is a lesson plan, do this, do that. That's not what we were looking to do. So we thought about a framework. And when we looked at the 4 pillars, this was just the first one, right? Starting with racial identity in the early years, which is typically not something that's taught. I don't know if you ever heard about racial identity development in any of your early childhood teacher training programs.
Absolutely.
Obviously, obviously as a Black woman, right? But it's not formalized, right? And so, that had to be the first place to start. So we decided to move forward with the first part of a larger framework and getting it out the door. Because if it took 5 years to do this part, I don't know how long it's going to take to do the rest of them. So we started working on what that would look like. And so the idea was, we need to show early childhood educators and parents and caregivers what is racial identity? How does it develop in the early years? And what can we be doing to make sure that it's healthy, right? Because it's really something that can develop healthy or unhealthy or positive or negative, right? And for people who tend to be racialized, right? Kids of color, whether they're Black or Latino or Indigenous or Asian, right? They experience racial identity development differently, right, than white kids, right, who are racialized differently around that. And there's so much research out there, but it's usually looking at middle school, high school, young adults, right? But we know that racial identity development is happening in the younger years. And so I've been teaching this in my college courses forever, but I wanted to get it out there. And so I'm so glad you said it's digestible, because that was my first goal. Like, take everything that you would get from me in a couple courses at a college and put it in an easy reader format, which, as you know, isn't easy all the time, right? So that's the big picture behind it. And yeah, I had to finally pull the trigger and publish it, because, you'll spend forever going, oh, it's not ready, it's not perfect, it's not ready. And, we said, yes, let's do it. Let's put it out there, and let's hope that it's a resource for the educators.
And what type of environments do you see the framework being used in? Like, what is in your vision, where do you see this tool being able to be implemented?
Yeah, I think it can start with anyone, right? Anyone can download it and read it. Anyone who works with young children can take a look at it. Where, centers, right, who want to do PD around it, right? A group of educators could do it. I know some of our colleagues are thinking about how they might bring it into their coursework, right? So it is something that if you teach students, they can all download it, you can use it. So it's meant to be self-guided, right? Like any person can read it and go through it on their own, but then we will also offer support, professional development support around it. So right now we launched our reflective practitioner series, which is a subscription based kind of professional development series of different courses. We had one with Kisa Marks last year, and so I'm leading the current one using the framework. So we already had our first video I'm recording, and now we have another one this next Monday, and then another one in April, and followed by Zoom discussions. So those are just opportunities for me to take you through the framework, right? So we can do something like that. Folks can get together and do their own group study around it, right? Because educators have been doing this work for a while, can jump right in. So I think it can be used in a variety of ways. I think it can be used for different folks, where we wanted it to be early childhood, birth through 8, and not just educators, right? Parents. I've done this workshop several times with parents at a cooperative in Brooklyn, right? And they were very interested in it as well too. And parents have a role to play with this because the socialization is happening within all the systems that are really close to the child. So parents, schools, communities. And it's great if they're all on the same page. So if we can get early childhood teachers and parents together using the framework, right? Learning from it, reading through the materials, going through the guided questions. There's case studies in there that we created to really give folks an idea of what this might look like in practice with young children. So, and although it's specifically, I think most of the case studies around pre-K, 3, 4, right? Maybe even 5 or first grade, infants and toddlers need this too, right? I just think, I'd love to work with some infant and toddler teachers on what that might look like, because it's very different. Some of the things are different, like what they're aware of, and the language, of course, might not be there. But how can you support an infant and toddler who's developing a sense of identity, and they're noticing, skin color and skin tone and hair and these different things? But so yeah, I think it can be used for a lot of different people, and I hope a lot of different folks will use it in many different ways.
And now let's crack this open a little bit and
Okay.
have you dig in and tell us a little bit about what to expect, because I think a lot of times people find there are people who find the topic scary, or who worry about parents of white children and how they're going to react to talking about this racial identity, whether it be administrators at school. So how are you able to communicate the context and the ideas of healthy racial identity to families, to administrators, to educators in ways that don't scare them?
Yeah, it's super important, because I get it. It is scary, because a lot of us, we all have a racial identity. We've all had it developed throughout our lifetime, some healthy, some unhealthy, but we haven't had a lot of time to reflect on that. So my first thing is to say, like, I want to see racial identity thought about the same way we think about language development, social emotional development, cognitive development, physical development, moral development, right? Those are all areas of child development that educators know very well, that parents even understand because they got little kids at home, they get it. And so this is just another aspect, right? Racial identity is just another type of identity development, just like those others that we all know and accept, and believe it's our job to help develop, right? We spend our time thinking about how do we support language development and cognitive development, all these things. And so I want people to just find it that way. It's just another type of development. It's just one that's not really talked about, because unless you're a psychologist studying racial identity, most people don't really think about it. So the framework begins with the adult, right? The educator, the parent, the caregiver, starting with their own racial identity, right? Because you have to unpack what this was like for you to really understand it, and then think about how you might do this with young children. So we start by looking at your own identity. And it's not just race, right? We're looking at race, ethnicity, and culture in the framework, but you have many different identities, right? So we do the social group identity assignment, where you look at all your different identities and then determine where you are, right? In some identities, you're in like a dominant group, right? Where that group has, they're the most accepted, they get the most privileges, or you might be in the subordinate group, right? Where you're the target. And so we all have them. Like, I'm not all of my identities put me in a target group, right? There are some where I'm in the dominant, right? Education, social class, right? Things like that. Age, right? I'm at that age where I'm not too old and I'm no longer too young, right? So I'm right in that sweet spot. But then, of course, other things around gender and race and things like that will put you in more of a target group. But you got to examine all that. And then we get into examining the messages you received about these identities, because there's a cycle of socialization, and that's the theory we're using. And Bobby Harrow framed this theory. And in their application of it, we're receiving socialization messages based on how we are in these groups. And some of those are positive and healthy, and some of those are negative and unhealthy. And so the idea is to think back, what messages did you hear about different parts of your identity? And how did those impact you, especially when you were younger, right? Or maybe when you got older? How has being in these identities, most people don't think about like disability and ability, right? They tend not to think about that until they become temporarily disabled or permanently disabled. Then they start really focusing on it. So the idea is to just think about those identities, think about the message you received, and understand the process of socialization. Then we move into, okay, what is racial identity and how does it develop in young children, right? So I compiled all the research that I had been teaching and reading and learning about racial identity development. It's really interesting that you said about the concerns about white parents and white children. And it's a lot of the research, psychologists have been studying white racial identity development for years, right? Janet Holmes is an amazing African American psychologist, and she has studied and created a framework for white racial identity development. And it's so powerful because it shows the different stages that a lot of white people go through when they first become aware of race and racism, and how they're perceived, right, as a white person, and against how other people are perceived. So it's really about two things: how you see yourself, right, as a person, whether you're white or a person of color, and then how other people perceive you, right? Those are the two things really make up the identity. And so we look at that, we look at race, we look at culture and ethnicity, what it is, what do the models tell us, right? So we have an understanding. And then what do we know about how it develops in young children? They typically don't have the big shifts in identity because you need to be a little bit older to develop some of that, but they are trying to make sense, right? So they're
Yes.
saying things. So what we
Mhm.
hear in young children, what we'll hear in white children sometimes is we'll hear racial superiority comments, right? Well, they'll say, no, you're not allowed to play with me. You can't be a princess. Only white girls are, and they might not even say that, right? Only blonde girls are princesses, or your skin's too dark to be the prince, right? You'll hear those types of things because they're trying to make sense of race and racial identity. But because they're identified as white, they tend to take on a superiority tone. And then you'll hear kids of color, not all, but many, talking racial inferiority, right? Where they might say something like, oh, I don't like my hair. I don't like it. It's too curly, or it's not straight, or my skin's too dark, or things like that. And so that's what the framework is really wanting you to see, is how those conversations are happening in young children. You're probably hearing them already. Many people are ignoring them because they don't know what to do. And this framework is saying, don't ignore it. Here's some things you can say or do to support young children. So then the last part is, okay, now you know what racial identity is. You examined your own racial identity development and the messages you learned. Now, how do you foster healthy racial identity development? So there's resources, like I said, the case studies to really think about when a teacher does this, how is that supportive, right? How do you intervene when children are having these conversations among themselves? Parents sometimes are trying to address these as well. So we give a variety of case studies, conversation starters, right? A child might say something. What are some things you might say back? And just lots of resources to support teachers. And so hopefully that process of those three things, starting with yourself first, then understanding a little bit about what it is and how it develops, and then what's your role as an educator or parent or caregiver.
I really love the starting with yourself first. And I mean, so much of this work anyway is self work. Like, as
Yeah.
an educator, you really need to be vulnerable to do this work well, I believe. So that's another, I guess, level or layer of that vulnerability that you have to have. And I also love the vision, like when you talked about parents and educators doing this work together. Like, I can see that being such deep work, and
Yeah.
the children deserve that. Like, they deserve us to do this hard work. I mean, it will be challenging because you're tapping into your own experiences. Like, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's raw. Like, for me, to even as you're talking, sitting and thinking about some of the messages that I got about, being a Black woman, having dark skin, having a
Mhm.
round bulbous nose, like things like that. Those type of things are embedded into who we are, who we become, how we see ourselves. And I mean, it's better to do the work ahead of the negative self-image being developed
Mhm.
than it is to have to undo it later, you know?
Yeah,
Let's
yeah,
do
for
this work
sure.
ahead of that. Let's um, protect and inform our children so that this is not a cycle that we're continuing, to have. So this is very, very, very important work. And I keep envisioning parents and educators working alongside each other for this. So you got to the portion where after, we as the adults do the self work, you talked about some of the tools that are there for us to then support children as they're experiencing this. You also touched on some of the language and biases that children have that are they're embedded in our society. So
Mhm.
you can't protect them from it in that, you know, you experience it while reading books. You experience it
Mhm.
while watching movies. You mentioned princesses. Like these are the things that are downloaded into children's understanding just from their
Mhm.
experiences. So is there a way to, I mean, for me, I curate my books. Like I am
Mhm.
intentional about, not even like you said, it's not just about race, it's the storylines. How are the characters positioned in the story? I
Yeah.
was reading a book the other day, and it's funny because my I guess my meter has
Mhm.
shifted, and I'm even more keyed into some of the messages that children download from books and stories, even stories that I'm reading to them, some of the
Mhm.
messages that are downloaded. So I'm cutting out a lot more books than what I had before, just because those aren't messages I want them to have. I was reading one book, and it was a, just a, I can't remember what story, but a classic story. And the dad was promising his daughter to the first gesture that, you know, did a
Mhm.
trick that entertained him or something. And I'm like, what message am I wanting the children to walk away from when this story's over? So I think for me, part of the work has been to really hone in on the messages, the underlying messages
Mhm.
and biases that are embedded in children's literature, in stories that, that I've told over and over again. And I'm like, wait a minute, hold up. Let me think about that a little bit deeper. So how does that portion of the work show itself? Do you guys talk about specifics to literature, language,
Mhm.
those types of things? Because even being in the classroom with children and the way that we address children, or the way that we, for example,
Mhm.
I've been in situations where I've observed a classroom and noticed that the female children, the girls were put in
Mhm.
the kitchen for